Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on ethics, values, and the work of community engagement. We really appreciate you sharing your thoughts in this initial poll with us. It seems like there's this interesting mix between people who think that this work is really important and also people who think that this work is really challenging and complicated. And so hopefully we can start to shed light on how we think about those challenges through our conversation today. This event is hosted by SEEDS. SEEDS stands for Stories of Ethics, Engagement, and Dialogue in Science. And SEEDS is an initiative designed to foster dialogue about the ethical issues in science and the approaches that scientists can take to understand them. SEEDS is organized by ComSciCon, a nonprofit best known for its workshop series on science communication skills for STEM graduate students. ComSciCon's work on SEEDS is generously funded by our sponsors, the Kavli Foundation and the Rita Allen Foundation. Today, in this webinar, we're addressing one of the major goals of the SEEDS program, which is to elevate the stories of scientists who engage with the ethical dimensions and implications of their research. So through this webinar series, as well as a publication arriving later this year, we are bringing attention to how scientists can start to do the boundary spanning and community-oriented work that is really needed to bring societal considerations into the research process. And today we have with us two expert speakers who will help us explore how values and community engagement can both inform and be informed by scientific research. First, we have Dr. Natasha Udu-gama, who is a highly accomplished expert with over 11 years of experience in community science program development and partnership building. During her tenure with the American Geophysical Union, she was instrumental in growing the thriving Earth Exchange program from 5 to 370 community science partnerships globally. And second, we have Dr. Mackenzie Graham. Dr. Graham is a senior research fellow at the Ethics Center at the University of Oxford, and his research is primarily interested in bioethics and data ethics. He has a particular interest in the philosophy of trust, and his research examines the moral status and well-being of patients with disorders of consciousness. So together, our speakers bring a wealth of expertise to help us explore how scientists can approach research that is grounded in ethics, trusted by communities, and ultimately conducted for effective service to society. We're so glad to have these speakers with us today, and we're going to start by having each speaker share a little bit about their work and their journey to where they are now. And after that, we will have a moderated discussion led by Julie Fornaciari, one of our SEEDS programming managers. And we'll also plan to leave some time for audience Q&A at the end, so please feel welcome to leave your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Mackenzie Graham, and he will get us started with these intros.
Great. Thanks very much, Meredith. So yeah, I'll say a little bit about myself, how I got to be doing the work that I'm doing now with at the Kavli Institute for Nanoscience Discovery here in Oxford. So I trained as a philosopher, sort of moral philosopher. So most of my work now is in bioethics. So I first started working with scientists as part of this DPhil project several years ago, more years ago than I would like to admit. And this project was on well-being and disorders of consciousness. So these are patients that have suffered kind of catastrophic brain injury and were diagnosed as being in the vegetative state. So they're non-responsive at the bedside. And these scientists discovered that a proportion of these patients are actually, they still are conscious, even though they can't demonstrate their consciousness behaviorally. This is the standard way that you would assess consciousness at the bedside. So thinking along the lines of, if you can hear me, raise your hand or sort of blink or wiggle your toes. So these patients can't do that. So they were thought to be unconscious, so in a vegetative state. But they actually could demonstrate their consciousness by imagining certain tasks. So when you put them in an fMRI machine, which is like a big magnet that measures areas of activation in the brain, they could do this on command. So they could imagine walking around their house or kind of vigorously swinging a tennis racket back and forth when they were instructed to do so. So this was functionally the same as raising your hand to command. So this raised a lot of interesting and difficult ethical questions about what's it like to be in a state like this? What should we do for these patients? Are these lives good quality lives? Are they acceptable quality lives? Would these patients want to have their lives ended? So this was sort of where the discussion went when these patients sort of first came to light. And there were some philosophers that, or ethicists that thought this is a terrible kind of existence. Um, we shouldn't be keeping these patients alive. And then other people working in the field, and I would consider myself as part of this group, thought, well, this is maybe a bit too quick. Maybe we need to think a little bit more carefully about the nature of their well-being. So a lot of my work was with scientists in trying to unpack these sorts of issues. So thinking about quality of life in this very sort of diminished state. So then I transitioned from that to thinking about sort of neuroimaging data more generally. So as many of you probably know, there's a lot of value being put in medical data now, used to train sort of AI models and these sorts of things. So there's a lot of interesting ethical issues to be sorted out about ownership of data, what it should be used for, how we can respect people's privacy and autonomy, and whether they want to share their data or not. So I was interested in sort of brain imaging data in that respect. And a lot of the questions related to data sharing center around this concept of trust. Why should we trust these institutions with our medical data? And actually, does this really involve trust? Are we more interested in sort of robust security measures, or do we want to trust these institutions, or do we want sort of assurances that our data is being used in the correct kinds of ways? So there was a sort of natural marriage between my philosophical interest in things like trust and sort of medical data. And then sort of coincidentally, I was talking to someone who I now work with closely at Kavli at a police data ethics meeting about trustworthy scientific institutions. And she said, well, we're really interested in thinking a bit more about what makes us a trustworthy scientific institution. And I said, well, we should have a chat about this. So we got to talking sort of over the course of several weeks more about this, about what would make the Kavli a kind of trustworthy institution. So then we put in a bid for some funding from the Kavli Foundation, which we were lucky to get. And I've been working with Kavli scientists for the last 2 years, thinking about the sort of ethical dimensions of their work. Now, the challenge with working with discovery scientists, and I shouldn't say it's anything particular to do with discovery scientists themselves, it's more to do with discovery science. The ethical issues are not always quite as obvious as they are when we're talking about more applied kind of science, where we can see the direct impact on human life right away. It's not quite so obvious where the ethical issues are in discovery science because the impact is usually so distant. But it is there. So a lot of my work has been uncovering the role that values play in the sort of internal parts of science. So how we choose our research questions, what kind of methodologies we adopt, how we communicate our research findings in a way that conveys the appropriate level of excitement, but without stepping into sort of hyping of our science. So I thought this was going to be more about your traditional kind of bioethics stuff. But my time at Kavli has really changed my view of what the sort of ethical issues are in discovery science. They often seem a bit more ordinary, but they're no less important because they really shape the kinds of knowledge that gets generated from these scientific institutions. So thinking about the role that value plays in this sort of scientific work and helping researchers to sort of come to grips with this and think about how this affects the sort of objectivity, we might get into this a little bit more, of their work is kind of what I'm interested in now. So that's all I'll say. That's a bit about me. Thanks, Meredith, and I'll pass the baton back.
Super interesting. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about all of that through the conversation. And next, we'll pass it off to Dr. Udu-gama to give her introduction.
Thanks so much, Meredith. So if you'd asked 20-year-old me what community engagement meant, I'd have probably guessed that it was something involving a clipboard, something like an add-on. At the time, I was an undergrad studying international development, and I had the whole thing figured out, or so I thought. Struggling countries basically needed to climb the same ladder that wealthier countries had already climbed, more infrastructure, more GDP, getting everyone essentially caught up. Then a professor of mine at the time who taught development anthropology gave a special talk that had nothing to do with my coursework. She was laying out the differences between international development and disaster management, and somewhere in the middle of that talk, something clicked into place for me that I still think about today. Her point was this: international development as a field often has a destination in mind. It wants to move from a place up from low development to high development, and it tends to define high development in pretty Western terms, development acting like a band-aid for deep-seated issues. On the contrary, disaster management doesn't work that way. It responds to what a specific place actually needs, issues that caused a disaster as it affects humanity, whether it be man-made or natural. It starts by asking what's actually happening in this place to these people shaped by their own history and culture. And it builds the response around that answer instead of answers imported from somewhere else. And I remember sitting there thinking, that's it. That's the difference between an intervention that respects the community and one that quietly assumes that it knows better. So I finished my degree in international development with a critically different mindset. I ended up going on to do a master's in disaster management and eventually a doctorate in human geography, three fields that all share one thing in common. They take the people on the ground seriously as the experts on their own lives. That belief got tested for real a few years later in a way that had nothing to do with the classroom. When the Indian Ocean tsunami hit in December of 2004, tearing through Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and a dozen coastlines in between, I was sitting in a fairly cushy, comfortable research position at Virginia Tech, working on Homeland Security. On Boxing Day 2004, I remember watching news coverage of my parents' homeland, Sri Lanka, getting completely devastated, and something in me made a decision faster than I could talk myself out of it. I left that cushy job and found the first opportunity to go to Sri Lanka. I ended up finding my way to Sarvodaya, which was Sri Lanka's largest community-based organization, and they handed me a job that sounded straightforward on paper. Basically, help build a strategic plan for their brand new disaster management center. What it actually meant was walking into a room where money from a half dozen international donors was pouring in, each one attached to its own goals, timelines, and definitions of success. My job, in theory, was to make these donor goals line up neatly with what Sarvodaya itself needed and valued. In practice, I spent most of my time discovering how rarely that alignment happens organically. The strings attached to that money did not match the priorities of the people the money was supposed to serve. I was not writing a strategic plan so much as trying to really hold space where the donor's definition of the success and Sarvodaya's definition of success could actually meet. And more oftentimes than not, they didn't. It was not the triumphant homecoming story I might have imagined when I booked that flight, but it did teach me something I've carried into every project since then, and especially since going into the Earth and Space Sciences at AGU and beyond, that science and the funding that makes science possible has to be structured around what a community actually needs, not the other way around. It is remarkably easy for a good idea and even good money to do harm simply by arriving with its own agenda already attached. So here's the message I would like to leave with you today. We are living through a moment when trust in science is not something anyone can take for granted. Misinformation travels faster than a peer review paper ever will. And I think the way scientists earn back that trust is not by shouting louder. It's by staying humble and enough to remember that we too come from communities, every single one of us. Before we were scientists, we were somebody's neighbor, somebody's kid, somebody who grew up somewhere with its own logic and its own needs. Community engagement isn't charity work that we do on the side of our real research, whether it's discovery or applied. When we do it well, it makes the science itself sharper, more relevant, more honest about what it doesn't know. So my hope for all of you today is a simple one. I'm not here to tell you that you need a whole new skill set or a degree in anthropology to do this work. I'm here really to give you a few honest, specific ideas for how to start connecting your own science to the communities it's meant to serve, whoever they might be. Stay curious, stay humble, and let's dive in. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. These are both really inspiring introductions, so I'm very excited to see where things go for this conversation. So at this time, I'm now going to hand the mic off to Julie Fornacieri. She's one of our programming managers with Seeds, and she will be moderating the discussion. And just as a reminder, feel free to put any questions for the speakers into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end.
Yeah, so thank you, Meredith, and thank you both to our speakers. Your introductions were a great sounding board and starting point for this discussion, so we're really excited. So first question I really want to ask you all is really, and whoever can go first can answer, because I think you both can give insights. But when working with scientists or people who influence or apply research, how have you started the conversation about what ethics and values are embedded in their research? I want to start that, Mackenzie.
Yeah, for sure. So I think fortunately, in some cases, people come to me, right? So in the case of some of the work that I've done here at Kavli, the scientists themselves felt like there was a sort of ethical issue here. So one anecdote is they're doing research on anhedonic depression, and they're using brain tissue from people that have died by suicide, and so they felt a bit uncomfortable kind of about this. Um, and so this really just required a sort of conversation teasing apart why this made them feel uncomfortable, whether there was a sort of ethical issue here. Because sometimes we think that there might be an ethical issue just because things make us feel a bit uncomfortable. But there isn't necessarily. Sometimes just that awareness that there could be is sort of enough. So sometimes in these conversations, there's work to be done in clarifying what the ethical issues actually might be, or whether there are any. I think, I mean, too, in this particular institute, they do a lot of work with organoids, which are sort of complexes of cells that, I mean, they wouldn't like this sort of language. It's like a mini brain or a mini organ or something. It's really not. They're sort of approximations of this, and there's a worry that the more sophisticated these models become, the more they're like the more they're like a human brain. What if they become conscious or things like that? So these are issues that are sort of lied to the researchers anyway. So sometimes they'll come to me with them. But I would say most of the time in this context, it's just providing these sort of forums that are organized around a topic that I sort of intuitively think might be relevant to people, and kind of saying just what do you think? Does this resonate with you? And it's meant to be sort of open so that they can then steer it in the direction that is most useful to them. Because I've been quite struck by this. Most of the researchers here are quite switched on to the ethical kind of questions and dimensions that their research might raise. It's just not always clear that they have the language to kind of express this, or that the institutional structure is such that they kind of have to pack these sorts of things away, right? So I get lots of scientists ask me, I reflect sometimes on, is what I'm doing, is this actually an important question? Is this a worthwhile question to pursue? So clearly these things are live issues to them. They just sort of need a forum to put them out there and work through them and unpack them. So oftentimes starting the conversation is pretty easy. You kind of just need to give people a venue to do this, and they're quite happy to do this because they are thinking about these things.
Yeah, I concur with a lot of Mackenzie said, especially in terms of the fact that many of you in this audience are here because you got into science because you wanted to give back in some way. And that's something that I recurringly heard when I was at Thriving Earth Exchange and in those early days at AGU, where we were just trying to develop Thriving Earth Exchange. And I actually had a lot of doubts as to whether Earth and space scientists would be interested in working with communities in the way that we eventually got them to. But when I started having those discussions, when I started talking to scientists, and when we started asking them questions like, why did you get into science? What motivates you and to do the work that you do? Who is sort of funding the research that you're doing? We were able to really get a sense of their motivation and like why they actually got into science and what they cared about, what they really valued. So I think it's really important to stay curious, as I said earlier in my introduction, to really continue that curiosity that brought you into science. You really try to get the sense of the values and the ethics that drive those scientists into getting into science and discerning, what kind of work they have done in the past and how that has been funded. So, like, for instance, in one of the projects at Thriving Earth Exchange, we were talking to a few scientists. We were trying to get a sense of whether those scientists had the right motivation for working with a community that had been affected negatively by oil and gas. And so, for instance, if like Exxon was one of the funders of their research, and we knew that Exxon had been one of the companies that had adversely affected the community, we knew that that type of motivation, that kind of discernment from the scientist side, wasn't particularly what was right for that community. Um, so yeah, it really does take sort of staying curious, staying grounded in sort of the various types of communities that you come from, and sort of asking the right questions.
Great.
Julie, I wonder if I could say
Yes,
just one
100%.
one quick thing about this, and actually, I'm curious to hear sort of what Natasha thinks about this. Um, I've sort of found that calling these things ethics often doesn't land that well. I think oftentimes scientists think of ethics as a sort of, it's a regulatory thing, it's a compliance thing. Ethics is sort of scary. It means sort of obstruction. It means a lot of paperwork. Um, I don't, it's something to be avoided,
Yeah.
put it that way. But actually, what ethics is really about is something that people are really interested in. It's just calling it ethics kind of sets us down the wrong track towards sort of compliance and regulation. I don't know if that's been sort of your sense as well. Like when you talk about what matters to people or what they think ought to be done, that's really what we mean by ethics. But that word has been sort of captured by regulators in a sort of
Yeah.
unfortunate way.
It's a really good point, Mackenzie. Like, I think words really do matter. We found this with working with communities, which I was going to talk about later, but with scientists as well, like asking questions in a way that doesn't sort of negate their beliefs or put them off in any way that will, prevent them from actually being impactful and useful in the work. So I think really finding the right words and, I think especially in the sciences, we tend to get caught up with certain words. Again, I'll talk about that later, but I think it is really important to just be as inclusive, but at the same time, honest about what it is that you truly do value and believe in, if that makes sense.
Great. Love the riffs off both of you. So kind of building off really what you both were talking about, and looking at it as like the scientific enterprise, and particularly how we just kind of talked about ethics is turned into regulations. But curious on both of your perspectives of like what pressures or incentives besides maybe that, do you think are most shaping scientists' abilities or instincts to grapple with these considerations? So happy for Mackenzie or Natasha to start us off.
Um, Natasha, do you want to go ahead or?
Please.
Okay. Okay. Um, I think I would say, as far as the sort of institutional kinds of pressures, I think that publication pressure is a major sort of obstacle to this kind of stuff. Um, and I guess I mean this in sort of two ways potentially. So there's a challenge in being sort of explicit about the role of value judgments when you're doing ostensibly objective science because it can be sort of perceived as detracting from the kind of objectivity or the authority of the science. I think so. It's sort of better in a way, career-wise, to just say my work doesn't pose any ethical issues, and then you just don't really have to deal with it. But I also think that, and maybe this is improving, and actually I suspect this is slightly different in the sort of UK context than it is in the US. But um, good quality engagement doesn't really serve career progression in the way that it should. I think we sometimes pay lip service to the importance of engagement work, but we don't tend to promote people on the basis of good quality engagement. We tend to promote people on the basis of impactful publications. So there really aren't these sort of institutional incentives to do this. And because people have a lot of time pressure on them, and good engagement work is time consuming and it's expensive, and it's worth doing, and it really contributes to the science, but not necessarily in a way that's recognized by the traditional measures. So impact factor and these sorts of things. So that's definitely a challenge, I think. And I think institutions sort of ought to put their money literally and sort of metaphorically where their mouth is. If they're saying this stuff is really important and it's something we value, you need to create space and incentivize people to do it, I think.
I just kind of want to keep snapping to that. But Natasha, please add on because I think that was such a great and well put thought. So thank you. But yes, please.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that before doing any research, and I wish I'd done this even more so than I had before my PhD, really be sure about your values. Reflect and contemplate why that research is really important and the implications of the research, of doing the research on the people or on the environment. So just because your work doesn't immediately have the implications on people or the environment as a whole in the immediate sense, like really try to look at the big picture. I'm reminded a lot of a fellow PhD student when I was studying in Australia, who also happened to be an American. And after we had done our sort of 6 monthly review of what our research, our presentations to other students, we were reflecting back on that. And she was in the physical geography section, I was in the human geography section, and the human geographers amongst us were really quite enthused about the opportunity to share our research and the impact that it had on the people that we were intending to work with. At the very end, we noticed that the physical geographers had been very quiet, but one of them finally stood up, and she was an American, and she said, I don't understand how you, pointing at our academic leader, can think that we as physical geographers can talk about the impact in the same way that the human geographers do. And there was something in me that got really livid, and I don't usually get really worked up and start, speaking out. But I had to say something, especially since she was also an American. And I was like, no, everything that we do, if it isn't relevant, we're all human beings, and human beings are asking these questions. So if you've asked this question about, say, a leaf and the impacts of something on that leaf, that means that it is important to human beings. And so I think it's easy for, discovery scientists to say, well, I can't be thinking about that right now. And, in the age of AI and everything too, I don't know if any of those researchers and engineers actually stop to think, actually, is AI a good thing for humanity? Now we're starting to look back at that, right? But I think if more interdisciplinary scientists come together and talk about these things at the outset, we could come to solutions that are actually very beneficial for all of humanity, no matter where they are and where they're at. So just stop there. I think I got a little bit up on a soapbox there. Sorry.
Love the soapboxes. No, please continue. But yes, I think those are all really great points from both of you. And I think kind of diving a little bit into the research process that we want to focus on. So maybe this is a little more targeted to you, Mackenzie, but I'd love both of you to maybe chime in. How do you approach surfacing those implicit values you both kind of talked about in research and in that process, and whose outcomes are harder to conceptualize and predict?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's a challenging question. I think part of the reason that it is challenging is because it sort of cuts against the ways that a lot of scientists are sort of trained, I think. They're not necessarily trained to think about the sort of, well, they're not necessarily trained to think about value judgments in the sense that I think we're talking about them. I think they're trained to see science as a sort of broadly objective kind of activity, where we are sort of here to not uncover truth per se, but I mean, it is about producing knowledge. And in order for this knowledge to have authority, it's not just a matter of my opinion. that kind of thing. And so I think admitting that there are value judgments that go into the scientific enterprise, not just what questions we choose, but how we interpret data or what we take to be sort of significant, saying that this is a sort of value judgment sort of minimizes the authority that it's supposed to have. It makes it seem like it's really, oh, it's just subjective. This is just your opinion, so we don't need to sort of pay attention to it. So I think there is a sort of disciplinary hurdle to get over in saying that just because science is value laden doesn't mean that it lacks authority or lacks rigor, or it's now just purely subjective or purely political and all the and all that baggage kind of entails. So the question of how we do this is coming up with sort of, well, not coming up with, but finding examples, historical cases to sort of illustrate the role of value judgments in research in ways that are consistent with the ways that scientists see their daily activities. So one of the things that we've done at Kavli, we had this sort of artifact kind of exhibit. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get the sort of historical artifacts themselves because there's a whole process that you need in order to keep these things safe. They have to be in special glass cases or what have you. So we just had really nice images of them, right? But so historic kind of like the first mass spectrometer, and then tying this to questions about measurement. So what kinds of assumptions are built into the kinds of measurement tools you use? What kinds of background assumptions inform the research that you do? What sorts of things that we took for granted centuries ago, and now we say, well, actually, we know that the world sort of doesn't work like this. We know that sickness doesn't come from sort of bad air, It comes from germs or something. But we understood the world in a certain kind of way, and that informed our science. So this is the sort of role of values, if you like, certain kinds of scientific assumptions. And this is the sort of language that scientists understand, I think. And it doesn't sort of diminish the authority of science, because there have to be these value judgments in the scientific work that we do. So it's making this less abstract by presenting it in ways that are already sort of familiar to scientists, I think.
Anything to add to that? But that, I think, was great. Perfect. So kind of switching a little bit onto the community. So Natasha, I'm going to be focusing this one on you. How do you approach community engagement such that communities can connect with the science and engage in the dialogue around it? You've brought up a couple examples of that, but really like putting it concretely for our audience members. Do you have any advice on like that approach?
Yeah, I mean, so much, but I'll try to. So, it's very important to that community engagement, I think, be the starting point of any research. And I think more oftentimes than not, and as Mackenzie mentioned earlier, like there's insufficient time and money potentially being placed on sort of developing the relationships that are important for that community engagement. However, it is changing. And I was recently talking to a funder just 2 days ago, actually, about just the fact that they are putting more funding into researchers who develop the relationships that are needed for ongoing community engagement. And they're actually looking for those researchers who are, looking to sort of include communities on an ongoing basis. So as I mentioned, we're all part of some community or another. And so if we're part of a community, if we ask a question, I think just that curiosity is like typically the basis of any research. So if a scientist or if science is curious about a thing, it's often the fact that others have thought about it. And because we're all really, ultimately, we're all connected in some way, form, or another. We're part of the human consciousness. Mackenzie knows this probably. So if somebody's thought about a question, somebody else has also thought about that. And so if that curiosity could be and then just sort of thinking, could that question, is it coming from a good place? Is it potentially a harmful question to ask, or is it going to marginalize or be harmful to a specific community? And sort of test it, like ask that question with the various types of communities that you are working, you think that your research could affect. So make sure that that research question just resonates with as many different types of people as possible, with as many different communities, and that you can explain those potential impacts on humans or their environments and why it's important to the human condition. I mean, that's really ultimate. It seems really, basic, but it is actually really fundamental to every type of science that we could actually do. And yeah, I come more from the social science side, but I think even Mackenzie might say, like, yeah, I mean, everything, like the questions that we're asking are ultimately questions that human beings have about things that affect us in our world. So that's what I'd say. There's
Yeah. And then just quickly to follow up on that, especially because our audience might be a mix of social scientists
Mhm.
and like physical scientists, really, how do you think scientists as a whole can strengthen their ties so it's not extractive, it's not a one-off type of experience? Because I think you're really leaning into that, staying curious, and I think grounding it in like
Mhm.
our humanity, which is great. But curious of, yeah, how do we make sure that it's not just this extractive type of exchange?
Well, I would just say engage deeply. So if you're interested in working with a community and you have never worked in that community before, ask to be part of, say, a community forum. These are some of the guidelines we would give to scientists who are working within the Thriving Earth Exchange at AGU. So really engage deeply, get involved in as many communities that you are a part of or that you identify with. Um, Remember that regardless of whatever title you have, just stay humbly human. Because I just can't stress that enough, because like it's so easy to get caught up in titles and degrees and this and that. Um, and maybe a little controversially, if any of you are not yet a PhD, but maybe you're considering it, just don't do a PhD for the sake of it. I remember even being told by a meteorologist at the Bangladesh Meteorology Department when I was finishing up my PhD and my research in Bangladesh was he told me, make sure that you do something impactful with this doctorate. And it was something that I was like, yes, I want to. And honestly, I would say that I didn't do enough for the communities that I researched in Bangladesh that I would have liked to have done. And I think that is the factor of sort of the way that these research projects are developed. Um, so I would argue that most PhDs, including mine, are extractive. We should be seeking to build upon those good questions and sort of improve the human condition, our environment, and our sense of wonder. Like, I'm not taking away at all from the sense of wonder, because I know that's probably what a lot of scientists in this room are, engaged in. And just constantly talk about research about your research to everyone, from your peers to your grandmother. And if any of them find it hard to understand, just continue to revise and improve your pitch so that anyone and everyone can understand what it is that you're researching. So really consider deeply the values, the cultures, the fates of the communities that you're engaging in. I don't know if maybe I'm a little repetitive, but I just can't stress that enough. And that was something that ultimately I saw with, the scientists that we engaged with at AGU, that they were all people who really were motivated by that sense of curiosity and wanted to get into science to give back to humanity in some way. And I remember being told by multiple scientists, like, I've always wanted to do something like this, but there was never an opportunity until HU developed that program. So that was just really, really eye-opening for me, because I had a lot of doubts about, that when I first started. So keep it there.
Awesome. And then we're gonna move on to our Q&A from our audience because we've been getting lots of good questions in there. And I'm gonna try and prioritize it as fast as possible, thanks to the Seeds team behind the scenes. But I would love to know from both of you, like maybe really quickly, we could talk about this and more in the Q&A, but like what advice would you give to scientists who are excited to do this type of work and integrate it a little bit more? I know you've said a lot of like, be authentic, make those connections, like go really deeply and know that like sometimes our, publications are important, but we have to ground in like what are our values. So yeah, if you have like a one sentence advice, I know that's hard, so give yourself a second and I can figure out the next question. But yeah, would love to know like what is your advice to this community today?
I think maybe do your research on the foundations, the funding landscape out there. More and more, as I briefly mentioned earlier, there are those foundations, there are those donors who are interested in research that really centers the community in the work that you're doing. Um, it's amazing how much I've seen the difference between like 12 years ago and today. That more and more they are those funders, and I would say like Sloan, for instance, is one that I just spoke to recently, just to give them a shout out. But there are so many others, like Kavli, I'm sure Mackenzie would say Kavli, and Moore Foundation, and others who are really um, interested in the how of community engagement and how those researchers are continuing to do that through line. Yeah.
So I mean, I would draw a slight distinction between sort of engagement, involvement, these sorts of things. I think um, if you're excited about your science and you want to share that with the public, I think that's really great. I think you shouldn't be afraid of sharing your excitement about your science with the public. Um, you don't, yeah, give the public credit. They can understand it if you explain it to them. They can share in that excitement. I think if you're interested in sort of engagement stuff, in actually co-producing research and having public involvement, sorry, not involvement, but public kind of shaping your research, that's the kind of thing that, as Natasha was saying, you can't try to bolt that onto an existing project. That really needs to be part of your thinking at the very beginning. And it really requires some careful reflection about what purpose this engagement is serving. It's not the kind of thing that you can just try to append to a good project. So really give yourself some time to really think about what purpose this is serving.
Perfect. Okay, so we have more questions that we've already prepared, but we want to make sure that we get some Q&A questions because we've gotten some good ones come in. So we've touched a little bit on all of these, but really want to amplify who we're talking to today and how they ask the questions. So for both of you, ethics can change with time and as communities evolve. How can we ensure that the knowledge we create is not misused in the future, even if it's ethical now?
So, Natasha, do you mind if I take that one first? I mean, as a philosopher, I would push back against the idea that ethics can change. I think what's right is I mean, that's just sort of my philosophical view. I think what's right is independent of us and is sort of constant. So what we think is right might change. That's definitely true. Um, and so how do we ensure that the scientific knowledge that we generate now is not used in the future for sort of bad purposes? Um, I mean, that's a really difficult question, and I'm not entirely sure that's something that we really can control. I mean, you look at sort of once we discovered sort of how the atom worked, and then that turned into atomic energy. I can't rem I might be making this up. I don't think I am. But one of the people that was involved with CRISPR said that if she sort of knew about the ways that this might have evolved, she's not so sure that she would have sort of made the discovery. Now, would somebody else have made the discovery? Quite possibly. I think having sort of useful processes in place, and that part of this is going to include involving communities in discussing what kind of periodically what kinds of applications of science we think are appropriate in order to prevent us from sort of hurtling into a future that we are not going to be comfortable with. I don't think we can sort of prevent those eventualities now, but by sort of periodically checking in with what we think is appropriate, I think is probably the most effective way to sort of avoid disaster. I don't know if you would want to flesh
I
that out.
completely agree with you, Mackenzie. Like, I agree that ethics don't typically change. I think it's just the opinion of what is right and wrong does change, as we can see in our society today. And yeah, just periodic check-ins. I think that's really important in everything, like just build that into your research.
Perfect. Okay, so again, for both of you, do you have, and if we could follow up with the audience also for this, if you do have them and you don't have them handy, but do you have any resources that help with articulating and exploring our values in science communication as scientists?
so many I
specific
could
resources.
probably, yeah, sorry. Mackenzie.
So, I mean, as far as articulating your values, do you mean like what kinds of research issues are sort of important to you? Like we should be studying this disease rather than that disease, or what your sort of career progression kind of values are, these sorts of things? Or do you mean more like um, other kinds of like epistemic values, like you prefer scientific theories that are sort of elegant and simplistic as opposed to, like that kind of thing. I feel like I mean, there's a whole rich sort of literature on the role of values in science that comes from this sort of feminist philosophy of science, which I mean, I could definitely recommend some of that. I'm not sure that that's necessarily what you mean, though. I would read Douglas. I would read Helen Longino. I could go on, but yeah, it's Karen Douglas.
Perfect. And Natasha, do you want to chime in with any that come to mind since you said there's also a bunch? I don't have the answer to some of those rhetorical questions, but I'm sure the audience members appreciate kind of what you were thinking about because I think that's a good way to approach these questions.
Yeah, I can think of a lot. Nothing specific comes to mind. I think sometimes we get a little bit hooked on, especially as researchers, I think we get a little hooked on wanting to hear what other people have to say about these things. And again, not necessarily really contemplating and reflecting upon what is like, because we all have that knowledge and we have sufficient knowledge at this point in our careers. I would say probably I could speak for most of the people on this webinar too, that we should be able to ascertain that if we really think without allowing opinions and others' thoughts to sort of influence us. So I know that's not particularly satisfying potentially because it's not giving you a specific reference, but happy to find others if that's necessary too afterwards.
Or I should just say it's Heather Douglas, not Karen Douglas. Heather Douglas.
Perfect. Thank you for that clarification. And yeah, I think really building off of what you both said, especially when we're thinking about values, but then as scientists, there's lots of misunderstandings that can occur. And a couple of people have asked a little bit about misinformation. And so a couple of people were just like, how do we break through the disconnect and like perpetuating misinformation and or starting to when you only have a few minutes to talk to someone, right? Like how do you address sometimes those like heavier questions to really detract from that misinformation, I guess, and really be grounded in those values? A couple people have asked that, so would love your thoughts.
That's a tough one. Natasha, do you want to?
Julie, I'm sorry, I was slightly distracted there. Could you please repeat that question?
Yeah, it was also a little long-winded. Basically, it's people are asking like how like do you have thoughts on how to break through when misinformation is prevalent? So when we think about misinformation about climate change and like
Mhm.
especially when
Yeah.
you only have that like elevator pitch or that few moments to talk to people and really connect, like do you have
Hmm.
any advice on really like how do we address those really
Yeah.
common things that come up, especially as researchers when we're working on so many different topics?
Yes. It's a great question. And it is something that I think I've had to grapple with a lot, especially when working with scientists and connecting them to the communities that were coming to us at AGU and Thriving Earth Exchange. One thing I would just say as an example, we had a lot of, I was recently talking about this to some other group, I think, but we were getting more and more communities from the South and Florida, Southern United States, who were sort of grappling with issues of climate change. But, given the thinking, given the values of that part of the country in comparison to other parts where climate change wasn't necessarily a phrase that folks really resonated with. And so we had a lot of climate scientists who were coming to us and they kept talking about climate change, climate change, climate change, and realizing that, they were getting a lot of pushback from those communities. And this is not about really misinformation. It's really about really, you know, again, talking clearly about the issues and talking in a way that really resonates with the community. And I think that's one way to do that. And so we suggested to them from our experience really to think about it in terms of climate variability, flooding, things that were really hitting close to home for those communities. So I think that's one way, is really to try to understand the language, the lingo of those communities, and try to speak in terms, not to dumb down things or anything like that, because people are intelligent. They know about what, I remember sitting in community meetings in Bangladesh, and when I was asking them about how they dealt with floods, they said actually the biggest issues in our community is education and healthcare. We've dealt with floods for our, entire lives. It's not an issue, right? And that was one of the first times too that I was just like, whoa, these are the sort of biases that we come in with oftentimes if you're coming from an external viewpoint. So I see Mackenzie nodding, maybe he has something more to add.
No, I mean, I agree totally with this, that there's a lot of good research suggesting that if we're framing this in terms of sort of trust, people's lack of trust or mistrust of science generally doesn't stem from a lack of understanding of the science. Now, of course, they're not going to have as sophisticated understanding as the experts, but I mean, that's not really what we're talking about. So a lot of people that are sort of climate skeptics, it's not even that they don't necessarily believe that climate change is real. It's that they're skeptical of the sort of applications of this information. So this gets to what Natasha was saying about there's a sort of value misalignment there. So if you're talking about your science, if you're a climate scientist and they say, well, that climate change, that's all sort of made up. Presenting them with the facts is not necessarily going to change their view, even if your facts are sort of airtight, right? Because you're sort of talking past each other at that point. To me, the strategy is to say, okay, well, I mean, why do you think that? And then eventually it's going to, probably what happens is it's more like, carbon taxes affecting their business or something like that. So it's not good for them if this is sort of true, if you see what I'm saying. There's a sort of value disalignment. So talking about things in terms of ways that sort of respect and acknowledge sort of people's values and kind of differing values. It's not really about the science per se. It's about what's done with the science and the sort of politics around the science, I think, that causes a lot of this stuff. So yeah, just insisting on the facts maybe isn't the strategy that you want to avail yourself of. But I think listening to what they say about why they're skeptical about it is probably going to be more fruitful.
Awesome. Yeah, can't nod enough. Um, we have so many questions. We are not going to get to all of them because we are almost at time. I do want to ask one last question that I saw pop into the chat, and hopefully to the audience members that have stayed on for this, maybe we can send out an email to registrants or things like that. Haven't figured out what, but we can hopefully answer some of those offline. But clearly, just like from both your perspectives, how do we make this work sustainable? Like, how do we continue this work? Is kind of one thought that people have a question on. And like, if you have a strategy, you can make it quick, we can follow up on it. But yeah, how do we make this work sustainable?
I think this should be a part of DPhil training. I think this should be a part of earlier training to get scientists comfortable with thinking about these sorts of issues. By the time you're getting to sort of later career stages where there's all sorts of other competing pressures, and trying to sort of reframe your approach to doing research is difficult. And also there are so many other competing pressures on your time that's just a resource that you don't necessarily have. So I think doing this earlier on, I think as part of sort of doctoral training, I think would be a good thing to do.
And I would just add on to Mackenzie, totally agree. And I think with the crisis that our higher educational institutions, maybe including Oxford, but especially in the United States, are experiencing, I think it is very important that this be part of those, not only graduate degrees, but even going even further back potentially, like just finding opportunities to incorporate this into your undergraduate degrees. I did a lot of volunteering outside of my undergraduate to sort of make sure that this part and parcel of how I do my work. And I think, of course, the funding landscape is changing too. So I think ultimately, like the researchers will have to start showing, even if they have right now the pressure to publish. I think there will come a time where it will be pressure to publish plus demonstrating how they're doing this kind of work in an ongoing way.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you both so, so much. I'm going to bring Meredith back up here just so she can kind of give our official outro, but it's been a pleasure moderating. This was an awesome conversation. I learned a lot and can't wait to honestly re-listen to it so I can actually digest everything you said. But thank you so much. And Meredith, back to you.
Yes, thank you, everyone. This was really wonderful and such a rich discussion. And I think I too am going to have to go back and listen to the recording just to catch all the bits and pieces of what was said. So, really amazing discussion. And thank you to our audience for being here today as well. As you exit the meeting, please take a moment to complete the survey, which will appear in your browser window. We really appreciate your feedback. If you'd like to stay engaged with ComSciCon and this type of work, we encourage you to learn more about us. ComSciCon is the organization that is hosting this webinar, and we also put on science communication conferences for STEM graduate students across the US and around the world. So you can check out our website for more opportunities to attend and participate in that. Today's webinar was recorded and it will be available to view and share on our YouTube channel in the next few days, and we will send out an email to the registrant list when that's available. And you can also follow ComSciCon on LinkedIn for more updates, including our future webinars and the Seeds publication, which is coming later this year. So again, please take a moment to share your feedback in the post-webinar survey when you exit the meeting. And thank you all again for being here. Have a great day.